Hi, good afternoon. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs, or CGA. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and provide a quick introduction to who we are for those of you who may be new to our community. Since its founding, our goal at CGA has been to prepare global citizens to make a positive impact in the world. We do this through a variety of activities, including our two graduate programs, one in global affairs and a recently launched MS in global security, conflict, and cybercrime. We also offer a wide variety of professional and personal enrichment courses in the areas of global affairs and fundraising, and this includes several professional certificates. And of course, we host conversations such as this that expand upon the critical issues and timely topics that we cover within our classrooms. For today's conversation, we've reserved some time for Q&A for the audience. So we encourage you to submit those questions via the Q&A tool. Now for today's moderator. Dr. Andras Valmas-Goldman is a senior non-resident fellow and adjunct professor here at the CGA, where he teaches courses on international law. His work in the field of international justice began at the turn of the century, when as the political coordinator and later legal advisor of the Canadian Permanent Mission to the United Nations, he worked on the creation of the Sierra Leone Special Court and became the founding chair of its management committee. He was also a part of the Bureau of International Criminal Court Preparatory Committee that established the ICC as a functioning judicial institution. More recently, he helped to found and became the executive director of Justice Rapid Response, a hybrid intergovernmental mechanism to improve the credibility of accountability for international crimes. So now, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Andras to introduce today's event. The virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you, Michelle. I would like to welcome and thank everyone for joining our panel discussion today. In addition to NYU Center for Global Affairs, this panel is also sponsored by the American branch of the International Law Association, International Criminal Court Committee, and Committee on the United Nations. Our topic today is meant to be thought-provoking. Our title is When Vetoes Enable Atrocity Crimes. What if the Security Council were not blocked from acting when faced with atrocity crimes? There are many indications of the international community's longstanding and growing disquiet over the persistent deadlock in the UN Security Council, especially in situations involving atrocity crimes. To my knowledge, no one has argued that the Security Council must be able to act in all or even most situations. Rather, it's the consistency of its inaction which creates a permissive environment for the worst crimes known to humanity that has given the international community unease. Nowhere is this broad concern more apparent than the overwhelming support enjoyed by the voluntary veto restraint initiatives, such as the French-Mexican Initiative and the ACT Code of Conduct, and the emergence of other constructive initiatives like Liechtenstein's proposal of having mandatory discussions in the General Assembly each time a veto is cast under such circumstances. Or indeed, the legal arguments presented by Professor Trahan in her recent book entitled Existing Legal Limits to the Security Council Veto Power in the Face of Atrocity Crimes. There have been many debates and even more panel discussions concerning the merits and the effectiveness of these approaches. They have contributed greatly to now broadly accepted understanding that when facing situations involving genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, a consistently deadlocked Security Council is creating an increasingly permissive environment for those crimes to occur, with negative effects not just in the lives and rights of people involved, but also on international peace and security. What has been less often considered is whether there are even further consequences to chronic Security Council deadlock in the face of atrocity crimes. The human cost of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity must always be of paramount consideration. But our world has become so interconnected that it is inevitable for there also to be other broader negative consequences. When it is predictable that violence and repression against civilian populations can go on with impunity, it is also predicted that it can also lead to some of the following: larger and more frequent refugee and IDP flows, which place ever-increasing burdens on our ability to meet exponentially increasing humanitarian assistance needs, as well as testing the limits of just how much movement of people is possible under today's unusually short governmental perspectives. This also distracting us from real challenges like climate change and pandemics, and of course, making us lose sight of development and prosperity goals that just a couple of decades ago seemed like within achievable reach for humanity. It's with these perspectives in mind that I turn to our distinguished panel today. I would like to introduce Ambassador Bob Rae, Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations in New York, Ambassador Christian Veneweser, Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein to the United Nations in New York, Ambassador Juan Manuel Gomez Robledo, Deputy Permanent Representative of Mexico to the United Nations in New York, and our very own Professor Jennifer Trahan, NYU Center for Global Affairs. And I would like to jump in right away with my first question, and this is to Ambassador Veneweser. Liechtenstein has played a leading role in the voluntary veto restraint initiatives, both the ACT Act Code of Conduct and the new idea of mandatory discussions before the General Assembly when a veto is cast. You have also been one of the most active and knowledgeable proponents for international justice over the last 2 decades. I see the nexus of these two activities as working towards an international environment that is less permissive to the commission of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. How do you see our progress in this effort?
Thank you very much, Andras, and it's good to be here with everybody, colleagues, and welcome to everybody participating in this. You know, to take up your question, but how do I see progress? I think the Security Council has certainly not gotten better in addressing accountability challenges, and in many ways, of course, the opposite is the case. There is a tendency to reduce the engagement of the Security Council to the question of its relationship with the ICC, which I do not agree with. The ICC is an important point of reference for the Security Council, but the Security Council has really a lot of other ways to do accountability work. So the first would simply be to emphasize the importance of ensuring accountability, to call on conflict parties to refrain from committing atrocity crimes, with the premise that it's national systems and national jurisdictions that have the first responsibility for these issues, and that's in line with their own statute of the ICC. The Council usually does not do that, and even in situations where where it is very obvious that atrocity crimes are committed at a large scale. So I think that is the first point. Now, if you turn to the ICC, the Security Council, of course, does have the authority to refer situations to the ICC. It has done that twice in its history, in the case of Darfur, Libya, and in Darfur, Sudan, and Libya. And the most recent referral, if you want to use that term, was 10 years ago. In 2014, a very significant number of member states asked the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the ICC, and that was, blocked by the veto of the Russian Federation and China. So the relationship between the Security Council and the ICC directly is, a very stale one, and I think it's very unrealistic to expect referrals of such situations to the ICC in the near future, which was very much what those who drafted the Rome Statute had in mind. So, I think in this situation, there's two things we can do. We can either be frustrated or we can try to find solutions elsewhere. And we believe that solutions have to be found elsewhere. And this is why we have taken the second initiative in particular that you have talked about, and that is namely for the General Assembly to take up issues that are not taken up by the Security Council, which, in our reading is perfectly compatible with the Charter of the United Nations, and in fact the General Assembly has done successfully in the case of Syria. So in the case of Syria, we did create the so-called IIIM, an accountability mechanism for Syria, the first of its kind. And, we were at the time the delegation presenting the resolution, and it was certainly born out of the deadlock in the Security Council, because there was simply no realistic expectation that anything would come from the council. And, the IIIM has been very successful and has been welcomed and hailed by many as a very innovative, important international justice mechanism initiative. And this is why we believe that every time we have a deadlock in the Security Council due to a veto, not only for atrocity crimes, but in particular also for atrocity crimes, this same situation should be considered by the General Assembly for possible action. So, it's I think it's a very mixed picture. We do not have very high expectations that the council will be doing better with respect to accountability. If you look at the political constellation, but for us that's not a reason to be inactive. Quite the opposite. I think we have to take matters in our own hand. Be very proactive, put things on the table, and present initiatives. I also want to make just one last comment, because you talked about, permissive environment, certainly true, and the evidence for that is overwhelming. If you look at, some of the crisis situations that we're dealing with right now, if you look at Sudan or if you look at Myanmar, you see that impunity for past crimes was a key element in enabling the commission of the current crimes. So the Tatmadaw that have grabbed power in Myanmar on the 1st of January illegally are the same people that committed the genocide against the Rohingya population. And, there is important action on the way before the International Court of Justice, before the ICC. But the fact of the matter is that nobody has been held accountable for these crimes so far, and the same people are coming back to commit very similar crimes against other parts of the population. I think that's a very important takeaway and lesson for us.
Thank you, Ambassador Vennereisser. In fact, allowing recurring cycles of violence to occur is one of the major problems of inaction by the Security Council, because without intervening, the cycles just continue, and they become not just humanitarian tragedies, but a huge distraction for us in the international community. Sorry, I understand my video was gone. It's back now. Let me turn to Professor Trahan for the next question. Professor Trahan, you have written a book entitled Existing Legal Limits to the Security Council Veto Power in the Face of Atrocity Crimes. You outline 3 independent reasons under international law why some legal limitations exist on the UN Charter's Article 27.3 veto power. Please briefly describe these arguments and how you see their application working together with the various voluntary veto restraint initiatives that have gathered so much support among states.
Great, thank you very much. And first, let me say it's a great pleasure to appear with these very distinguished co-panelists. I do also want to initially say, I understand that Canada has a policy requiring gender parity on panels, and I actually really, really applaud that. We did have a female PR who wanted to join us, and through an unfortunate date difficulties, we weren't able to accommodate, and I'm sorry that we don't have her joining us today, but I actually want to applaud Canada in their policy and to acknowledge that. So let me first describe a little bit about the problem that my book is responding to, which is simply the casting of the veto while there's ongoing genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or the serious risk of these crimes. I will intersperse a little bit, Andras, your framing of our question here today is, what if the Security Council actually worked? So I will add that as well. So the problem is basically when at least 9 other members on the council, which is the required number you need for a resolution to pass, have a measure designed to stop or try to curtail the commission of the atrocity crimes. Let me give some historical examples. So in South Africa, we have extensive veto use by the US, France, and UK, likely delayed the dismantlement of apartheid. And of course, there was considerable fatalities, I think an estimate of something like 20,000 during the apartheid era. So a delay in, it took eventually decades to have mandatory sanctions in South Africa. So a delay there, I think, is quite costly in terms of lives lost. In Rwanda, we have a different dynamic. The same 3P5 don't want the word genocide used, but it's operating somewhat differently because there's simply an underlying unwillingness to be involved. Regarding Darfur, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar, we have again, I think it's more the veto threat, or the fact that there is the veto prevents the Security Council really from having any significant response to horrific atrocities in all situations. In Darfur, we have veto threats watering down sanctions. So, Andras, you asked, what if we had a functioning Security Council? Well, sanctions on Sudan would have been an oil embargo, okay? They never do an oil embargo, and the arms embargo initially excludes the government of Sudan. So a Security Council that really could use all the tools at its disposal would have had a meaningful arms embargo to start. But we have delayed deployment of peacekeepers and deployment with a weakened mandate, all achieved through veto threats by China. Myanmar, we have one actual veto in 2007, would have condemned the commission of crimes. And the problem with when you can't even get out condemnation, then the Security Council obviously won't be able to ratchet up to other measures. And can you imagine how things would have been different? 2007, the council had actually said, we are watching, we condemn the crimes, and we're on this. So I think it's very, very significant. I do include all vetoes in my arguments. So the US also extensively uses its veto regarding Israel. Related to the conflict in Syria, we've seen 16 horrific vetoes preventing recognition of crime, blocking referral of the situation to the International Criminal Court, blocking chemical weapons inspections, even blocking humanitarian relief. And these are so clearly harmful. So, what if the council hadn't had these? Well, when the joint investigative mechanism was first started, there was a decrease in chemical weapons attacks or when in weapons inspections. And then after the joint investigative mechanism is vetoed 3 times, you have a resumption of chemical weapons attacks. So in that instance, we very clearly trace chemical weapons attacks and the veto power. So in this way, it's pretty clear the veto is costing lives. Andras, you referred to my 3 legal arguments, and I will just say the full arguments can be found in my book. They took over 100 pages, so I'm going to only be able to give like the 2-minute version here today. And as you mentioned, I have 3 independent arguments, and they look at the veto, which is found in Article 27.3 of the Charter. So think of it in the context of a system of international law. I think we often think of the veto as if it were above international legal obligations, as if it, existed in a separate universe from them. But we have something called jus cogens, our highest body of international law. It outweighs treaty obligations, and the Charter is a treaty. So the veto power is found in a treaty. And jus cogens protects, we have the prohibition of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity are all protected at this very highest level. They're peremptory norms of international law, from which no country, no state, no body under international law can even derogate from them. So why do we have free veto use when these crimes are occurring? At minimum, we could say it's inconsistent with legal obligations. I think a more aggressive formulation is that the veto is actually facilitating atrocity crimes. We can also frame it in the words of the International Law Commission, the Articles on the Responsibility of States for Internationally Wrongful Acts, Article 41.1, which recognizes the duty of states to cooperate to bring to an end through lawful means any serious breach of an obligation arising under a peremptory norm of general international law. So obviously, when you're blocking measures, you're certainly not cooperating to try to end these breaches. My second set of arguments relates to the UN Charter itself. So the veto found in the Charter is framed by the purpose and principles of the UN. These require respecting international law, respecting human rights, the obligation of good faith, and cooperation in solving international problems of a humanitarian character. I think the vetoes we have been seeing are out of line with all of these legal obligations, which under Article 24.2 of the Charter are binding on the Council as a whole. Now, if the Council as a whole is bound by these legal arguments, individual permanent members must necessarily also be bound because they are but a subset of the Council, but they're also states, and the Charter says the states are bound to the Charter. The third set of legal arguments we might consider are those under the Genocide Convention, including the obligation to prevent genocide, and under the 1949 Geneva Conventions and certain of the optional protocols, the obligation to ensure respect. This is an obligation on all states who are parties to these conventions, and all permanent members are parties to at least the Genocide Convention and 1949 Geneva Conventions. These impose due diligence obligations. They actually also create obligations beyond a state's own territory to try to prevent genocide and Geneva Convention violations in other countries. This is held by the ICJ in the Wall and Nicaragua cases. And this is due diligence that is triggered when there is a serious risk of genocide. We don't have to wait for the genocide to be occurring. And it is a due diligence obligation that varies based on a state's capacity to influence. And I suggest the permanent members have very strong capacity to influence, and therefore they need to try to ensure the crimes are not occurring. And I don't see the P5 acting in line, or certain of the P5 acting in line with that obligation. So I mainly address, you mentioned voluntary veto over restraint. I know I'm running out of my 8 minutes. I address my remarks primarily to the 3 permanent members who do not endorse the important voluntary veto restraint measures that Liechtenstein has led through the Act Code of Conduct, and Mexico and France have led through the French-Mexican initiatives that France and the UK are parties to. To end, I'll just say, in my book argues that states need to raise these legal arguments whenever they can, and I commend Ambassador Ray in a recent R2P debate last May, Canada taking the firm position the veto needs to be used in line with international law and the UN Charter. States need to make these kinds of statements and could consider issuing a General Assembly resolution on this topic and or referring a question to the ICJ, such as, is all veto use while there is ongoing or the serious risk of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes consistent with international law? Thanks, I'll stop.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let me turn to Ambassador Gomez Robledo from Mexico. Mexico has been another leading voice in trying to end deadlock in the Security Council, especially in situations involving atrocity crimes. The French-Mexican initiative is slightly different from the ATC Code of Conduct or the original S5 initiative, although they're all voluntary restraint initiatives, and they all aim to create a less permissive international environment for such crimes. My question is in two parts. First, do you consider the proliferation of and broad support of these initiatives to be a sign that most states really want to see change in the status quo ante? And second, the second part is, do you see an opportunity for the various initiatives, indeed the arguments that we just heard from Professor Trahan, for existing legal limits to the veto power in the face of atrocity crimes to be mutually supportive? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and I'm very happy to be with you all today in this very important panel discussion. Well, I would start first by jumping on what Ambassador Benavides said about the role of the General Assembly. The General Assembly by no means is limited by the Charter to not to intervene whenever peace and international peace and security are at stake. We all know that the role of the General Assembly is much more than being a subsidiary one. The International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion on the wall, reminded that the General Assembly has a concurrent role or concurrent responsibility with the Security Council. So by no means the Security Council has an exclusive responsibility. So the General Assembly has to take its own responsibilities. And this is why we have turned to the General Assembly in promoting our initiative along with France. Our initiative comes from perhaps a larger picture. And in the case of Mexico, that larger picture is a reform of the Security Council, where for us, the question of the membership is not the most important one. The most important one for us is a question of the methods of work of the Council. And among those methods of work, of course, the veto is paramount. And what gives us reason to be optimistic about the fate of our initiative is not just the fact that we have 105 states that have subscribed to the declaration that we have put forward some years ago. The question is that, let us remind what was discussed in San Francisco in 1945. And in 1945, let us remind that the veto was not only subject of a very important discussion, but there were important votes on it. Australia, for instance, submitted a proposal to limit the scope of veto to decisions taken under Chapter 7 of the Charter. And that vote was, the initiative of Australia was defeated. We were 10 in favor, 20 against, but 15 abstentions. And that discussion was not limited to those who were who had been participating in the previous discussions, let's say down Baton Rouge. France, which was invited quite lately because of very known reasons to join these discussions, before joining San Francisco, France had even made a distinction between decisions involving the use of force and mere recommendations. And for France, mere recommendations by the Council should not be subject to veto. Then we know what happened when we know, but immediately after San Francisco, I would say 3 years later, that discussion came back again. And it was very interesting to see that countries like China, for instance, said at some point that the veto power should not be used in all proceedings arising under Chapter 6 of the Charter, which is or the one on the Pacific settlement of disputes. The UK, for instance, said that the veto should be invoked when permanent members feel they consider the question to be of vital importance to the UN as a whole. And they would explain on what grounds they consider this condition to be present, which joins the initiative by Liechtenstein that at least permanent members go to the General Assembly and explain why they have vetoed a draft resolution, which in a way makes the price for that veto to be higher, because there will be some sort of accountability by just needing to explain the reason behind the veto. But even the US, for instance, did not consider I'm still speaking about 1948, the admission of new members as an issue that warranted the use of the veto, or which was, by the way, abused by the Soviet Union at the time. So if we go back to these years, permanent members, all of those that I have cited, the exception being the Soviet Union, were conscious that the veto had to be limited in a way or another. For instance, people think about atrocities, of course, and this is the most important thing and is the reason of this discussion. But are we really conscious that the veto has been used to block the entry of new members? That the veto could be used to decisions related to the suspension or expulsion of a member state, or that the veto has been used and can still be used on the appointment of a Secretary General. We have made a lot of progress in that regard in terms of the transparency and more openness in the process of the appointment of the Secretary General. But still, we are faced with a possibility.
Ambassador, you have become muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. These are reasons to believe that we have more, better atmosphere these days, and especially after what Christian Benaveser explained, and the very good figures reminded to us by Professor Trahan. We are facing in the Security Council a dual situation. On the one hand, every single day, the Security Council works tirelessly to keep a number of states to a level of survival. This is very much part of the agenda at the Security Council. Countries that survive merely because the Security Council is behind, with peacekeeping operations, with a number of political initiatives. And on the other hand, we have the tragedy of fights like the one on Syria or the Middle East, which more largely, which do not make any progress because of the veto. So we believe that we need to continue persuading member states to join on what will be, and that will be the end of my intervention, on what will be something absolutely political. We are not pretending to amend the charter. We are not that naive. This is something that would be limited to some sort of gentleman's agreement, or even a unilateral commitment, such as the negative security assurances, a unilateral commitment not to invoke the veto under certain circumstances. And once a permanent member would have made that commitment, the price to pay if that permanent member were not to keep up its commitment would be high. Let us just also remind that both France and the UK have substantially reduced their the number of times and the frequency in which they had invoked the veto. Even on Iraq, France never said openly that it would have vetoed the resolution put forward by the US, which in fact was never voted because the US did not have in 2003 the 9 votes it needed. So perhaps even the veto at the time was not even needed. So these are more or less my preliminary remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me now turn to our fourth panelist, Ambassador Ray of Canada, for perhaps the most challenging of all of the questions. During a recent R2P debate, you made the important point that the veto must be used in conformity with the UN Charter and with international law. Canada is also on the record backing voluntary veto restraint initiatives. And as we have heard, there is a good body of support and now persuasive legal arguments for a less fettered Security Council when facing situations we usually describe as the worst crimes known to humanity. The question is, Ambassador, do you think that this is enough to effect change? Or should we also be shining a light on the collateral impacts of this permissive environment for atrocity crimes, such as, as I mentioned earlier, the ever greater refugee flows, the constantly increasing humanitarian assistance needs, and the needless distraction from focusing on challenges like climate change, like pandemics, not to mention neglecting development and prosperity? Ambassador. You're still muted, Ambassador.
There we go. Thank you so much. I just would make a couple of points. The first one is the premise. My legal premise is the fundamental question of what do we mean by the rule of law? What does it mean? Does the rule of law mean that sovereign states can exercise their power in whatever way they want to advance their national interests without having to justify that exercise of power? Or does any exercise of power by a sovereign authority have to be done in accordance with the rule of law? And my premise is it's the second. There's a tension right now in the UN. I think it's important to describe it, to name it, between those countries that believe that the charter is really is a charter for state sovereignty, that it's nothing more or less than that the United Nations is nothing more nor less than a club of countries, all of whom are sovereign, and all of whom can conduct themselves in pretty well whatever way they want to advance their self-interest. Or is the charter actually a document that is based on the premise of the rule of law and of the importance of advancing certain common values, which were at their core the reason why World War II was fought? I don't need to go into the historical argument as to why I think the second argument is clearly right. But all we have to do is pick up our pocket copy of the charter and read it. And it's very clear that the references to the international rule of law, to the advancing of human rights, to equality between men and women, to advancing the cause of peace and peaceful settlement of disputes, that's what the charter is all about. That's the premise of the charter. So I don't think there's a case that can be made to say that if a country can't say if I have a veto, I can use it any way I damn well please, and I don't have to explain it to anybody. I think that argument has no justification in the charter and has no justification in law. I think anybody who exercises the veto has to do it in accordance with the charter. And all of the law that follows and flows from the creation of the United Nations and all of the agencies that we've created and the entire body of law which we have created since 1945. And I think these questions are really quite fundamental. Like the one that you're raising, Andres, is I think equally important, and that is, what are the consequences of countries exercising the veto in circumstances where it clearly contributes to not only a climate of impunity, but the reality of impunity in the face of overwhelming evidence of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and including the crime of genocide. Rwanda, Professor Trahan has mentioned South Africa quite rightly, but I would mention as well Rwanda. I'd mention Syria, as Christian has emphasized, and I would emphasize Myanmar. Now, we've tried to find ways around this. We haven't just let it go. We've said, no, well, let's figure out what else we can do. Christian quite rightly mentioned the IIIM, not only in Syria, but also now in Myanmar, where we are gathering evidence which can be used in any tribunal charges or anything that goes on with respect to trying to bring those accountable to justice. The Netherlands and Canada are also supporting the genocide application of the Gambia on genocide, and we're working together on bringing that evidence together and advancing it at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So, I mean, for us, this is something that we believe in. This is something that we're doing. But I think your question at the end really refers to something much broader, and that is that what is clearly at stake in this struggle that we're now in about the meaning of the charter and the meaning of the rule of law is that in the event that we were to, if we were to simply sit back and accept the argument of those who say, I can veto anytime I want to for any reason whatsoever, and there's nothing in the charter that prevents me from doing it, if we accept that argument, then we are in fact accepting an argument that says the Security Council and those who are permanent members of it are above and beyond the rule of law, which is contrary to the fundamental principle, which is, be ye never, ever so high, be ye ever so high, the law is always above you. I don't accept the argument that the king or the sovereign can do no wrong. The sovereign can do wrong, and the sovereign is subject to the rule of law. But that's really what's at stake here. And we should understand that if we don't keep fighting this argument and pressing it in every venue that we can and describing it and trying to get the support of more people in civil society and elsewhere, then we're entering into a period of impunity, lawlessness, and a place where any dictator or any perpetrator of high crimes and misdemeanors can point to the United Nations itself and say, look, they think they're all above the rule of law, then why wouldn't I be above the rule of law? And that gets us right back into the very reason that we fought World War II. We're right back, we are in a very dangerous way. We're entering into what has been called the dark valley, a dark valley of lawlessness, a dark valley of impunity, a dark valley of aggression, not only country to country, but within countries. And that's, frankly, that's why Canada is here. That's why we believe strongly that these arguments not only have to be made, but they have to be brought forward with as much clarity as we can so that people will understand exactly what is at stake. I don't think we can make a mockery of the ICJ or of the ICC or of the other institutions that we've created. And we do have to understand that by failing to address these issues, we are giving rise to much greater hardships and much greater difficulties for vast numbers of the population who are affected by climate change or affected by mass migration, as you have described, and the current refugee crisis and the other crises that we face. So there's a lot at stake here in really trying to understand the arguments that are being made and why this is, if I may say so, this is not a purely academic discussion. It's a very real discussion because it relates to this foundational question, and that is, if I'm a permanent member of the UN, can I do whatever the hell I want? And the answer to that question clearly has to be no, you can't. You have to exercise your authority and your power according to the charter and according to the rule of law. And that includes dealing with the atrocity question, which I think is so fundamental.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray. We have a number of questions in the Q&A, but I would very much like to do a very short second round, if all the panelists agree. And because Ambassador Ray's remarks were so poignant and so clear, but I would like to ask the three panelists, could you address yourself, just your reaction to what Ambassador Ray said? And Ambassador Ray, if you have time, if you could pick one point from the other three interventions that you would like to respond to. So 1 or 2 minutes, please. And let's start with Ambassador Gomez-Robledo.
Well, I think that the question now is what else can be done in the months ahead of us. I mean, these initiatives have been on the table for some time now, both the ACT and the French-Mexican one. The question, and it's very much in the mind of what Professor Trahan has been working on, is seeing whether we could turn to the ICJ I guess to ask for an advisory opinion. I think that it is very much in the in Mexico's DNA. Just yesterday, when we participated in the signature event that the Security Council led by, promoted by Mexico, one of our proposals was, which is something that we've been saying for a number of years, is that the Secretary General himself needs to be allowed to ask for advisory opinions without going through the voting of the General Assembly. In our view, this is something that can be done without also, again, amending the charter. And besides this very question, if the Secretary General were to have that authority, he or she could play much better his or her role in terms of preventive diplomacy. So this is just to say that there are several avenues, and one of them is to see what could we go in front of the ICJ for that, knowing very well that so far the ICJ has never declined to respond to an advisory opinion, to a request. It has never done so. But we may also have to admit that it has not always responded to the question, and that's a danger, and we need to be very clear about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Van Weser.
Thanks, Andras. Well, look, I think to take up Bob's point and to answer your question, I think from my perspective, there's two things. The first point is we have to say what Bob has said, namely, just because you're a permanent member of the Security Council, you cannot do anything that you want. And in particular, you cannot cast a veto that is against the purposes and principles of that very treaty that gives you the veto power. And we do not accept that, and you know, that actually undermines your own status as a permanent member and your authority as such. And I think that's sort of one strand, is one dimension. The second dimension is, I think we also have to make it very clear, if you can't do it, we will do it. So if you don't do things in the Security Council, we will do them in the General Assembly. There's not everything, you know, possible, but there's a lot that the GA can do. And, you know, I think that is the conversation that we have to be engaged in and prepared for, because, you know, the political constellation in the Security Council is not going to change anytime soon, and the council is deadlocked over a whole number of issues. And for us to say, you know, we will assert our authority as the General Assembly in such a situation, I think will probably also be helpful for the council in maybe getting back together in a different way and to try to do things. But, you know, clearly we have to show the alternatives, and we have to take the initiative to do that.
Thank you, Christian. Ambassador Ray, any point from one of the other interventions?
I would just very briefly say that I think they both have merit. I mean, if you look back at the Uniting for Peace resolutions and in the period around the Korean War, the Korean conflict, the parties were very clear at that time that they did not accept the principle that the veto was the end of the conversation. We had that discussion around Syria. One of the reasons we set up the IIIM in Syria was because we said, well, we have the power and capacity to do so. And frankly, we still have a battle in the Fifth Committee, which is where the budget is worked out, to save the budgets of those institutions which the what I would call the errant fundamentalists like Russia and others insist on, and that is to say, well, these bodies are not legitimate because they deal with peace and security, and they weren't accepted by the Security Council. And my view is that's a spurious argument. You know, the ICJ thing is another route. I think that's an interesting one. I think we can all think about what value that would have. But I mean, I do think one of the main things we need to do and continue to do is simply put forward these arguments and do everything we can to expose the struggle we are now in, because we are now in a time and situation when the notion of the international rule of law is being cast aside in the name of unfettered state sovereignty. And I think this is a serious challenge. We face it on the climate change issue, we face it in the COVID issue, we face it on a number of issues where international solidarity is being challenged all the time, and we have to fight back.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Trahan, final closing remarks, 1 to 2 minutes max.
Yeah. So just to commend Ambassador Ray on his thoughts, he phrased it very profoundly. It's really, do sovereigns have responsibility? And I'd say for the last 20 years, we've said, yeah, they do. I mean, this is the basis of R2P. It's the basis of the World Summit outcome document. It's the basis of there being a human rights movement, that sovereignty is not absolute. If you believe in human rights at all, you believe sovereignty is not absolute. And no one is above the law. So he brought it down to 2 very simple propositions. And one of the questions I already saw, it said, what enforcement mechanism is out there? A case could be brought. If you had a veto in the face of genocide, you could have a contentious case under the Genocide Convention. If you had a veto in the face of torture, you could have a contentious case under the Torture Convention. If you had a really egregious veto, you could bring an advisory opinion on that veto, or you could have an advisory opinion on a generic question. these cases can be brought. They're ripe for the bringing, and in the meanwhile raising these questions, raising all of these arguments, because I'll say, as we've seen the law evolve, that sovereigns have responsibility, we haven't seen yet that impact at all on how the veto is being used. We have seen it making inroads in other areas of international law and not be operationalized yet in this context. So that's what needs to be done.
Thank you. We already have many very good questions, and I don't know how much time we will have, but I think we should start. And let me start with the first question. I will read it out. And I think this one is to all panelists. The question starts: strongly support the legal arguments asserted by Professor Trahan. Do you think, Professor Trahan, that your three arguments should be put forward to the General Assembly every time the veto is used, and put those who have used the veto to justify their veto? Ultimately, our only recourse could be to continue shaming of those who are using these vetoes. Your thoughts on that? And this is straight to Professor Trahan.
Thank you for that question. So this kind of also merges with Liechtenstein's proposal that every time we have a veto, there should be mandatory discussion before the GA. So I think that would help shine light on our veto practice. And Michelle, you took away the question before I was done. I don't see the second part of it now. It has disappeared from the Q&A. But I had something else. But I was envisioning one legal case. I mean, it is hard enough to bring an ICJ case. So, but I think that would be incredibly powerful if we just get one ICJ case. Yeah, you could put these arguments each time, but that would be my goal for furthering enforcement. I'll keep it quick because I know we're out of time. Or running through our time.
Question, any of the other panelists want to respond to this question? Christian, for example, given that it's a reference to the General Assembly.
Well, look, I mean, the way the format we foresee is that the General Assembly convenes. I think it would be natural to give the delegation of the delegations that have cast the veto, the right to speak first, because we're interested in hearing what they have to say. They explain to us why they vetoed the resolution, why they think it's compatible with the purposes and principles of the Charter to do so, and then we can say what we think. And we don't have to take action, but I think we can. So the General Assembly, as in any other discussion, should have that option. And I think the three questions would certainly be very helpful to frame that discussion.
Great, thank you. Let me jump to the second question because it's not practice to usually mention who's asking the question, but in this case, I would like to say that it's from Professor Richard Goldstone, who we all know and who has held many very important positions in international justice. And the question is, I would strongly encourage states to challenge the legality of casting the veto in the face of atrocity crimes and hope states take up the challenge Professor Trahan has suggested. To that end, is there a role for NGOs and civil society? Ambassador Ray, can we start with you on this?
Yes, absolutely, Richard. Without any doubt, I think there's a tremendously important role for civil society. And I would remind everyone, we wouldn't have an international criminal court without civil society. We wouldn't have the Charter without civil society. If people hadn't descended on San Francisco in 1945, I don't think we'd have as strong a charter as we have. So yeah, I think it's not just the states of the world, it's the peoples of the world that have to be, and the institutions that they have created that have to be involved in pushing this debate and then try to figure out, well, what do the rest of us do in the face of these justifications for impunity? And I agree also with Professor Trahan when she said look at other ways in which we can get to the ICJ. I think we have these institutions. We haven't been using them a lot because I think there was a sense that it was all kind of futile, but I'm increasingly persuaded, based on my work that I've done on the Rohingya issue, that actually these institutions are really important to bring states to the bar of the court and to look at where we can make a difference. That's why we've joined with the Netherlands on the issue of torture and gathering evidence with regard to what's happening in Syria and how that evidence can be brought forward. Frankly, how we can use the double IM, triple IM mechanisms to get valuable evidence in front of courts. And I think the more civil society can encourage those efforts, the better off we are. I think it makes a huge difference.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists would like to respond to Dr. Goldstone? Ambassador Gomez Robledo.
Thank you. Very briefly, just to remind that the last conventions on human rights, the one on the enforced appearances, the one on the rights of people with disabilities, or the Ottawa Convention on landmines, were all the result of the push by civil society. Without them, we would have never achieved those multilateral instruments, and that is so true that just as Ambassador Ray was saying that the UN is becoming a club of sovereign states, the UN is also becoming a club where the voice of the civil society is being mute as in a way that had never happened before, where we are told that it's not about civil society, it's just about states. It's not about individuals, it's about peoples. So this is a time to insist in having civil society with us. And when we see, for instance, coming back to the ACJ, what the advisory opinion on nuclear weapons did, I think that we would have never gotten to the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons without that advisory opinion. It paved the way for a number of things that happened where, again, civil society was at the forefront. Thank you.
Thank you. We have maybe 4 more minutes, I think, on the panel. So let me jump down to another question. In fact, a comment and a question from a very important body, from the Parliamentarians for Global Action, who would like to thank the panel for an excellent discussion and would like to reiterate the Parliamentarians for Global Action endorsement of Professor Trahan's interpretation of the legal limits concerning the use of the veto, support PGA's support for Liechtenstein's initiative to ensure that the General Assembly takes action when the Council fails to perform its primary responsibilities under the Charter, as well as the ACT group and the Mexican-French initiatives to ensure alignment between Security Council decision-making and the imperative to prevent and address mass atrocities, as well as Canada's longstanding position on the international rule of law. So the question, in this respect, the question is, they would like to ask whether the United States and their allies, including the European Union and Canada, would be ready to debate eventual breaches of the UN Charter by the UN permanent members, i.e. abusing the veto power within the General Assembly, and eventually support a General Assembly resolution centered on the need to respect international law and the UN Charter. Who would like to take that first? Ambassador Ray.
Very briefly, because I have to leave, but I just would say my short answer would be yes. I think one of the key things that Christian has said is the importance of debate and the importance of really trying to bring things forward politically, which means at the General Assembly, which is the principal parliamentary body of the UN. So yeah, I do think that's where it belongs. And may I just thank everyone? I'm afraid I have to go back to the GA for something in a few minutes, but I've appreciated the opportunity to join my friends and been great to see you. Thanks for a very rewarding panel.
Thanks for joining us, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray. It was a real pleasure to have you. Any other panelists on the comment and question by parliamentarians for global action? Christian, I see your hand.
Yes, look, I mean, I think I've talked about this. Of course, we think the General Assembly is the place. And I think we need to, take this up very systematically. So, for example, we have, yesterday we had a debate, maybe it's still going on, I don't know, on Security Council reform. And, people come in and to talk about enlargement and who should get a seat at the table. I mean, the veto has to be part and parcel of this. There is no meaningful council reform without meaningful change to the veto issue. And I think we have to take it up there, but we also have to just, take initiatives, put them before the GA and just do things and not talk about this in a sort of a hypothetical and conceptual manner. And, we did that this summer when we adopted a resolution on the situation in Myanmar. A political resolution, and that was also because the Security Council was not able to express itself on this. And the language you find in the GA resolution is goes much farther than what the Security Council has been able to say. So I think that's the kind of thing that we need to do.
Thank you. Michelle, do we have a minute or two for the other panelists, or do we have to finish?
I think that's fine.
Okay, great. So Ambassador Gomez Robledo, any final thoughts from you?
Well, just jumping on what Christian just said, what we are aiming at is nothing that would involve any change of the charter. Just as we've been saying in the overall discussion on the reform of the Security Council, it starts with the working methods. And working methods, to a large extent, have evolved thanks to the elected members, the E10, who have been able over the years to refine a number of practices and codify them for a more transparency, efficiency, and even a democratization of the council. So the initiative that we have been promoting along with France is one that, again, would be the result just of political will, and where permanent members, they don't even have to gather around a negotiated text. I remember very well that when we launched the initiative, a number of people told us not to speak about regulating the right to veto. And certainly we don't say regulating, because it sounds like we are going to amend the charter. It's a political statement, a political will not to be above the charter, as it's been said during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And final word to Professor Trehan.
Oh, thank you. I guess I'll just close with endorsing so many of the remarks that no permanent member should be above the law. I saw that reflected in one of the comments. Sorry. And that seems to be as how we're treating the veto. There was a complex question about one of the cases and the interaction of use Kogan's and procedural issues. And I have to say, I don't think it's a sound proposition of law that something procedural can violate use Kogan's. Nothing can violate use Kogan's. I mean, I obviously have to distinguish the case in more detail than that, but Jus cogens is the overarching norm, and all of the powers of the council are derived from the charter and subject to it and international law and its requirements. So I know we're totally out of time. I thank everyone for joining. Thanks to the audience. Thanks to our moderator and our panelists. It's been a great pleasure.